Welcome back to Nighttime History. Today we will be exploring the remarkable journey of a young boy who became a medieval knight, following him from his earliest days as a page through years of rigorous training and discipline in 13th century England. Make sure to like this video to support our channel and let us know in the comments where you are settling in to sleep tonight and what time it is. The morning sun had barely crept over the horizon when young Hugh first arrived at Thornbury Castle in the autumn of 172. He was 7 years old, small for his age, with dark hair that his mother had carefully trimmed the night before. His father, a minor landowner with modest holdings in Gloucestershire, had secured this placement through years of loyal service to Lord Edmund. The boy clutched a small wooden chest containing everything he owned in the world. 2 tunics, 1 pair of good hose, a wooden comb his sister had made for him, and a small prayer book that had belonged to his grandfather. His mother had embraced him one final time at the gate, her tears falling silently as she pressed a scrap of cloth into his hand. It smelled of home, of the herbs she hung to dry in their hall. Then she turned away, and Hugh watched her figure grow smaller on the road until she disappeared entirely. The castle steward, a tall man with a stern face and calculating eyes, led Hugh through the great courtyard. The stones beneath his feet were worn smooth by countless footsteps over the decades. Servants hurried past carrying bundles of rushes and baskets of bread fresh from the ovens. The smell of baking mixed with the scent of horses and leather from the nearby stables. Hugh tried to take it all in, his heart pounding with equal parts fear and excitement. The steward spoke only once during their walk, to tell Hugh that he would address Lord Edmund as my lord and Lady Eleanor as my lady, that he would speak only when spoken to, and that he would rise before dawn each morning without fail. The chamber where Hugh would sleep housed 6 other pages, boys between the ages of 7 and 14, who served the household. They slept on straw mattresses arranged along the stone walls, each boy given a woolen blanket and a small space to store his belongings. The older boys barely glanced at him when he entered, already accustomed to the steady stream of new arrivals. Only one boy, Thomas, who was perhaps 9 years old, looked up from the leather strap he was mending and offered a brief nod. That small gesture of acknowledgement made Hugh feel slightly less alone in this vast, unfamiliar place. His training began the very next morning, before the sun had fully risen. A senior page named Geoffrey shook him awake in the darkness, and Hugh stumbled from his mattress, disoriented and still exhausted from the previous day's journey. He learned quickly that there was no time for hesitation in this new life. He dressed in the dim light filtering through the narrow window, pulling on his tunic with fumbling fingers numb from the cold. The other boys moved with practiced efficiency around him, and Hugh felt acutely aware of his own clumsiness. The first lessons were in service. Lady Eleanor required her pages to attend her in the great hall during meals, and Hugh learned to stand perfectly still for hours, holding a basin of scented water for her to wash her hands, or carrying messages between the high table and the kitchens below. His legs ached from standing motionless, and his arms trembled from holding vessels steady, but he learned to hide his discomfort behind a neutral expression. Lady Eleanor was kind but exacting. She corrected his posture with a gentle tap of her fan, taught him the proper way to bow, and showed him how to walk quietly so his footsteps would not disturb the household. She spoke to him in French during these lessons, insisting that he learn the language of the nobility, and Hugh repeated her words carefully, committing each phrase to memory. In those early months, Hugh discovered that a page's life was one of constant movement and attention. He learned to lay out Lord Edmund's clothes each morning, smoothing the fine wool and ensuring no speck of dust marred the fabric. He learned to help the Lord dress, lacing points and fastening clasps with fingers that gradually became more nimble. He learned the art of serving at table, how to approach from the left, how to pour wine without spilling a single drop, how to carve meat in the prescribed manner. These tasks were not merely chores, but essential training in the grace and precision that would later be required of a knight. The castle chaplain, Father Bernard, taught Hugh and the other pages to read and write. They gathered in a small chamber off the chapel each afternoon, sitting on hard wooden benches, while Father Bernard drilled them in their letters. Hugh already knew some basics from his mother's teaching, but here he learned to form each letter with careful precision on scraped parchment, using ink that Father Bernard mixed himself from oak galls and iron salts. The smell of the ink was sharp and earthy, and it stained Hugh's fingers a deep brownish black that took days to fade. They read from religious texts and chronicles of ancient battles, stories of Roland and Charlemagne, of Arthur and his knights. These tales filled Hugh's imagination during the long hours of service, and he would picture himself wielding a sword with the same valour as those legendary heroes. Music and poetry were also part of his education. Lady Eleanor believed that a proper knight should be cultured as well as martial, and she hired a travelling minstrel to teach the pages basic skills on the lute and recorder. Hugh's fingers were clumsy on the strings at first, producing discordant twangs that made the other boys laugh, but gradually he learned to coax simple melodies from the instrument. He memorized courtly poems and songs, practicing the proper inflection and rhythm until the words flowed naturally. This education in the gentle arts balanced the harder physical training that would come later, shaping him into someone who could navigate both the battlefield and the court with equal competence. When Hugh turned 10, his training shifted to include more physical pursuits. Each morning after prayers, the pages gathered in the inner bailey for exercises under the watchful eye of the master-at-arms, Sir Roland. He was an older knight, scarred from decades of warfare, with a permanent limp from an injury sustained in the Holy Land. Despite his age, Sir Roland moved with a fluid grace that Hugh found mesmerizing. He taught the boys to run, to leap, to climb the castle walls, using only small handholds in the stone. He taught them to swim in the river that flowed past the castle grounds, even in the chill of early spring when ice still clung to the banks. The training was relentless and often painful. Hugh's muscles screamed in protest as he hauled himself up ropes, performed endless repetitions of squats and jumps, and ran circuit after circuit around the bailey until his lungs burned. Sir Roland showed no mercy to those who lagged behind or complained. He would simply watch with those cold grey eyes until the boy pushed through his exhaustion and completed the task. Hugh learned that his body was capable of far more than he had ever imagined, that the pain was temporary, but the strength gained was lasting. Wrestling became a daily practice. The boys paired off and grappled in the dirt, learning holds and throws, how to break free from an opponent's grip, how to use leverage rather than pure strength. Hugh was matched with Thomas, who had become his closest friend in the household. Thomas was stockier and stronger, and in their early bouts he threw Hugh to the ground with ease. But Hugh was quick and agile, and he learned to use those advantages, slipping out of holds and getting behind his opponent before Thomas could adjust. Sir Roland would circle the wrestling pairs, occasionally stepping in to demonstrate a technique or correct a mistake. His hands were rough and calloused when he gripped Hugh's arm to show the proper angle for a throw. but his instructions were always clear and precise. At 11, Hugh began training with wooden weapons. Sir Roland issued each page a wooden sword, carefully weighted to match a real blade. The wood was smooth from use, polished by the sweaty hands of countless boys who had trained before them. Hugh's first sword felt impossibly heavy in his grip, and his arm shook as he tried to hold it extended. Sir Roland taught them the basic guards and strikes, making them repeat each movement hundreds of times until it became second nature. High guard, low guard, middle guard. Strike from above, strike from the side, thrust forward. The movements were simple, but performing them correctly while maintaining balance and control required immense concentration. The pages practiced against wooden posts driven into the ground, striking again and again until their hands were blistered and their shoulders ached. Hugh would lie in his bed at night, his muscles quivering with fatigue, unable to find a comfortable position. But each day he grew stronger, and the sword felt slightly less heavy in his hand. Sir Roland introduced them to the pell, a thick wooden post that served as their primary training partner. They struck it from every angle, learning to judge distance and timing, to put their whole body into each blow rather than merely swinging with their arms. The sound of wooden swords striking the pell echoed across the bailey from dawn until dusk, a rhythmic percussion that became the soundtrack of Hugh's days. Horsemanship training began in earnest when Hugh turned 12. He had ridden before, of course, but never with the skill required of a knight. The master of horse, John, was a gruff man with a thick accent from the Welsh marches. He had an almost supernatural ability to understand horses, to calm even the most skittish animal with a few soft words and a gentle hand. John started Hugh on an older mare named Griselda, patient and steady, who had trained many young riders. Hugh learned to mount and dismount smoothly, to sit properly in the saddle with his back straight and his heels down. He learned to guide the horse with subtle pressure from his legs and shifts of his weight to keep his hands light on the reins. As his skills improved, John introduced more challenging tasks. Hugh learned to vault onto a horse's back while the animal was moving, landing in the saddle with practiced ease. He learned to control his mount with his legs alone, leaving his hands free to wield weapons. He practiced picking up objects from the ground while riding at a gallop, leaning far down from the saddle until his fingers brushed the earth. John set up a course of posts and had Hugh weave between them at increasing speeds, teaching him to guide his horse with precision even at a full gallop. The bond between Hugh and his horses grew deep during these years. He learned that a knight's horse was not merely a tool but a partner, and that trust between rider and mount could mean the difference between life and death in battle. At 14, Hugh's status in the household changed. Lord Edmund recognised his progress and his potential, and Hugh was formally elevated from page to squire. This transition was marked by a small ceremony in the castle chapel. Hugh knelt before Lord Edmund and swore an oath of loyalty and service. The Lord placed his hand on Hugh's head in blessing and presented him with a new sword, a real blade of steel that gleamed in the candlelight. It was not a knight's sword, not yet, but it was a significant step toward that goal. Hugh felt the weight of the blade in his hands, the perfect balance, the deadly sharpness of the edge, and understood that he now bore real responsibility. As a squire, Hugh was assigned to serve Sir Geoffrey, one of Lord Edmund's household knights. Sir Geoffrey was in his late 20s, a veteran of several campaigns in Wales and Scotland. He was stern but fair, expecting absolute obedience but also taking seriously his duty to train Hugh properly. Hugh moved his belongings from the page's chamber to a small alcove off Sir Geoffrey's room. He slept on a pallet at the foot of the knight's bed, ready to attend to any need that might arise during the night. His duties expanded considerably. Each morning, Hugh helped Sir Geoffrey arm himself, a complex process that could take nearly an hour. First came the arming doublet, a padded garment that would cushion the weight of armour and absorb the impact of blows. Hugh laced it tightly, ensuring there were no wrinkles that might cause chafing. Then came the mail hauberk, a long shirt of interlocking iron rings that weighed nearly 30 pounds. Hugh had to help lift it over Sir Geoffrey's head, guiding his arms through the sleeves, then fastening the coif that protected the knight's head and neck. Plate armour was becoming more common among wealthy knights, and Sir Geoffrey owned several pieces. Hugh learned to buckle on the cuisses that protected the thighs, the greaves for the shins, the riri braces and vambraces for the arms. Each piece had to be attached securely and in the proper order. The care of this equipment became one of Hugh's primary responsibilities. Mail required constant maintenance to prevent rust. Hugh would place the hauberk in a barrel filled with sand and vinegar, then roll the barrel back and forth for hours to scour away any rust. The sound of the rings sliding against each other and the sand became oddly soothing, and Hugh often found his mind drifting as he performed this task. Afterward, he would oil each ring carefully, his fingers growing slick with the protective coating. The plate armour needed polishing until it shone like a mirror, and Hugh learned to check each strap and buckle for signs of wear that might cause a failure at a critical moment. Sir Geoffrey's weapons also fell under Hugh's care. The knight owned several swords, each suited to different purposes. There was the knightly sword for mounted combat, a lighter blade for wearing at court, and a heavy falchion for close quarters fighting. Hugh learned to sharpen each blade properly, maintaining the correct angle and edge. He cleaned and oiled them after every use, checking for any chips or cracks in the metal. Sir Geoffrey also had a collection of daggers, maces, and a warhammer, each of which required specific maintenance. This intimate familiarity with weapons and armour would prove invaluable when Hugh eventually became a knight himself. The training became more intensive and more realistic. Hugh now practiced with real steel under Sir Geoffrey's supervision. They would fence in the bailey, their blades ringing as they struck and parried. Sir Geoffrey was a skilled swordsman, and he pushed Hugh hard, exploiting every weakness in his guard, punishing every mistake with a bruising blow from the flat of his blade. Hugh collected countless bruises during these sessions, but he also learned at an astonishing rate. Sir Geoffrey would sometimes pause their bout to demonstrate a particular technique, moving slowly so Hugh could see exactly how to position his feet, where to place his weight, how to angle his blade for maximum effectiveness. They practiced mounted combat as well, charging at each other with lances in the castle's tilt-yard. The first time Hugh lowered his lance and spurred his horse into a gallop towards Sir Geoffrey, his heart pounded with a mixture of fear and exhilaration unlike anything he had ever felt. The thunder of hooves, the weight of the lance tucked firmly under his arm, the rush of air past his face, it was intoxicating. His first pass was clumsy, his lance wavering off target, and Sir Geoffrey's blow struck him squarely in the chest, lifting him from his saddle and depositing him roughly on the ground. The impact drove the air from his lungs, and he lay gasping in the dirt while Sir Geoffrey circled back, calling out corrections and encouragement. Over time, Hugh's skills improved dramatically. His lance grew steady, his aim true. He learned to absorb the impact of a strike, to keep his seat in the saddle even when struck hard. He learned to judge distances perfectly, to know exactly when to lower his lance for maximum effect. Sir Geoffrey introduced him to fighting with sword and shield from horseback, a chaotic and demanding form of combat that required complete coordination between rider and mount. Hugh had to control his horse with his legs and seat alone while wielding his weapons, striking at targets or opponents while maintaining his balance and avoiding incoming attacks. When Hugh turned 16, Sir Geoffrey began taking him on campaign. Lord Edmund's lands bordered Welsh territories that were often in dispute, and there were frequent expeditions to assert control or respond to raids. These were not the grand crusades of legend, but smaller, grimmer affairs. Long marches through rain and mud, camps that reeked of unwashed men and horses, brief, violent skirmishes followed by hours of nervous waiting. Hugh saw his first real combat during a skirmish near the border. A band of Welsh raiders had burned several farms, and Lord Edmund's forces pursued them into the hills. The clash was sudden and brutal. Hugh had imagined that his training would make him calm and focused in battle, but instead he felt a surge of pure terror when the enemy appeared. They came screaming down a hillside, weapons raised, faces contorted with rage. Sir Geoffrey shouted for Hugh to stay close, and Hugh obeyed, his hand white-knuckled on his sword hilt. The next few minutes were a confused blur of motion and sound. Hugh struck at a man with a spear, felt his blade bite into flesh, saw blood spray across his hands. Someone screamed. He was never sure if it was his opponent or himself. Then Sir Geoffrey was there, cutting down another attacker, pulling Hugh back into the protective formation of Lord Edmund's men. That night, Hugh vomited behind his tent, his hands still shaking. Sir Geoffrey found him there and sat beside him in silence for a while. Then the knight spoke quietly, telling Hugh that fear was natural, that every man felt it before battle, that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. He told Hugh that he had done well, that he had kept his head and stayed alive, and that was all anyone could ask in a first fight. Those words helped, though Hugh still lay awake for hours that night, replaying every moment of the combat, wondering if he could have moved faster, or struck harder, or protected his companions better. The campaigns continued over the next few years, and Hugh grew accustomed to the rhythms of military life. He learned to sleep in his armour when necessary, to eat whatever food was available without complaint, to march for days through hostile territory while staying alert for ambush. He learned the logistics of warfare, how to set up a proper camp, how to care for horses under field conditions, how to maintain weapons and equipment with limited resources. He participated in sieges, long, tedious affairs, where days of boredom were punctuated by moments of terrifying violence. He learned to scale ladders under a hail of arrows and stones, to fight in the cramped confines of a breach in a wall, to clear buildings room by room. Throughout these experiences, Hugh continued his broader education. Sir Geoffrey insisted that a knight must be more than merely a skilled fighter. During the long winter months when campaigning was impossible, Hugh studied tactics and strategy with Lord Edmund and his senior knights. They pored over accounts of historical battles, discussing what had worked and what had failed, debating the decisions of commanders. Hugh learned about logistics, about supply lines and forage, about the importance of terrain and weather. He learned basic engineering, enough to understand how to construct siege equipment or fortifications. He studied heraldry, learning to identify the coats of arms of various noble families, understanding the complex web of alliances and enmities that governed relations between lords. Sir Geoffrey also ensured that Hugh developed the social graces necessary for a knight. Hugh attended feasts and tournaments, observing how knights conducted themselves in courtly settings. He learned the elaborate etiquette of the hall, the proper forms of the dress for various ranks of nobility, the subtle art of conversation that could build alliances or diffuse tensions. He watched how disputes were settled through negotiation rather than violence, how marriages and treaties were arranged. These lessons were just as important as his martial training, for a knight needed to navigate the complex social landscape of medieval society as skillfully as he wielded a sword. At 19, Hugh had been training for 12 years. He was no longer the frightened 7-year-old boy who had arrived at Thornbury Castle clutching a wooden chest. He stood tall and moved with the unconscious grace of a trained warrior. His body bore the scars of his training and his campaigns, marks he wore with quiet pride. He could fight on foot or mounted, with sword or lance or any other weapon. He could read and write in Latin and French, play the lute competently, and discourse on philosophy or tactics. He had proven himself loyal and capable, and Lord Edmund decided it was time to grant him the honour he had worked toward for so long. The dubbing ceremony took place in the chapel on the Feast of Pentecost. Hugh spent the night before in vigil, kneeling before the altar in prayer, reflecting on the oath he would swear and the responsibilities he would assume. As dawn broke, he bathed and dressed in new clothes, a white tunic symbolizing purity, red hose for the blood he might shed, and a black coat representing the death he must be willing to face. His friends and fellow squires attended him, and Thomas, who had become a knight 2 years earlier, helped him prepare. In the chapel, before Lord Edmund and Lady Eleanor, before Sir Geoffrey and the assembled knights and nobles of the household, Hugh knelt. Lord Edmund spoke the traditional words, reminding Hugh of his duties to protect the weak, to uphold justice, to serve God and his lord faithfully. Then Lord Edmund drew his sword and touched it to Hugh's shoulders, first the right, then the left. "Rise, Sir Hugh," the Lord commanded. Hugh stood, and Sir Geoffrey came forward to buckle on Hugh's sword belt, the final symbol of his new status. The assembled company cheered, and Hugh felt tears prick at his eyes, tears of joy and pride and relief that this long journey had finally reached its destination. Sir Hugh's story did not end there, of course. He would go on to serve Lord Edmund for many years, to win honour in tournaments and battles, to eventually marry and have children of his own. But his years as a page and squire had shaped everything that came after. The discipline instilled during those early mornings in service, the skills honed through countless hours of practice, the bonds forged with his brothers in arms, all of these remained with him throughout his life. The boy who had arrived at Thornbury Castle frightened and alone had become a knight, not through any single moment of transformation, but through years of patient, difficult, often painful growth. And in that gradual building of skill and character lay the true story of how a medieval knight was made. If you are enjoying this content, please consider joining our community of nighttime travelers by subscribing and turning on notifications to support our channel. The cold autumn rain had been falling for 3 days when young Robert arrived at Ashford Manor in the year 1285. He was 8 years old, already tall for his age, with auburn hair that curled at his neck and freckles scattered across his nose. His father had died the previous winter, leaving his mother with little choice but to seek placement for her eldest son. Through distant family connections, she had secured a position for Robert in the household of Sir Walter de Clare, a wealthy knight with extensive lands in Kent. Robert carried only a small bundle, wrapped in oiled cloth, containing a spare shirt, his father's old belt knife, and a wooden horse his younger brother had carved for him. His mother had walked with him most of the way, but when the manor came into view, she stopped and knelt to his level, taking his face in her hands and telling him to be brave, to work hard, to remember his prayers. Then she kissed his forehead and turned back toward home, and Robert continued alone up the muddy road. The manor house was smaller than he had expected, built of timber and stone with a slate roof that glistened wet in the rain. A servant met him at the gate, an older man with a bent back who looked Robert up and down with an expression that gave nothing away. The servant led him through a side entrance into a warm kitchen where a fire blazed in the hearth, and the smell of roasting meat made Robert's stomach clench with sudden hunger. He had eaten only stale bread that morning. The servant told him to wait, and Robert stood dripping on the rush-covered floor, trying not to stare at the joints of meat turning on their spits or the fresh loaves cooling on a wooden table. Sir Walter appeared after what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. He was a broad-shouldered man in his 40s with greying hair and a scar that ran from his left eyebrow into his hairline. His eyes were sharp and assessing as he looked Robert over, asking his name, his age, whether he could read. Robert answered each question clearly, remembering his mother's instructions to speak up and look men in the eye. Sir Walter nodded, seeming satisfied, and told Robert that he would serve as a page in the household, that he would work hard and learn much, and that if he proved worthy, he might one day become a squire and eventually a knight. Then Sir Walter dismissed him with a wave, and the bent-back servant led Robert up a narrow staircase to the page's quarters. The room was small and draughty, with 4 straw pallets laid out on the floor, and a single chest for shared belongings. 3 other boys were already there, ranging in age from about 7 to 12. The oldest, a dark-haired boy named Edmund, barely glanced at Robert before returning to the wooden practice sword he was examining. The youngest, a small boy called Peter, who could not have been more than 7, watched Robert with wide, curious eyes. The third boy, Martin, who appeared to be about 10, looked up from the leather he was stitching and jerked his chin in greeting. Robert found an empty pallet in the corner, set down his bundle, and tried to make himself as small and unobtrusive as possible in this new environment. Life at Ashford Manor began before dawn each morning. Robert learned this his first night when Edmund shook him awake in pitch darkness, hissing that they had to be at morning prayers before Sir Walter or face punishment. Robert stumbled from his pallet, fumbling in the dark to find his shoes, following the other boys down the stairs by feel more than sight. The chapel was barely warmer than the outdoors, and Robert shivered through the Latin prayers he only half understood, his breath misting in the candlelight. Afterward came the morning meal, a simple affair of bread and weak ale served in the hall, and then the work of the day began. Robert's first duties were the humblest tasks in the household. He carried water from the well to fill the ewers in Sir Walter's chamber and in the solar, where Lady Margaret, Sir Walter's wife, spent her days with her ladies. He swept the great hall, pushing rushes into piles and replacing them with fresh ones scattered with dried herbs that released their scent when crushed underfoot. He helped in the kitchens, turning spits until his arms ached, plucking fowl until his fingers were raw, scrubbing pots with sand and cold water until his hands were red and chapped. The work was endless and exhausting, and Robert fell onto his pallet each night, too tired even to feel homesick. But there were lessons too. Lady Margaret, a gentlewoman with kind eyes and iron-grey hair, taught the pages their manners. She showed them how to serve properly at table, how to carve meat according to rank, how to present a cup with both hands, and the proper words of courtesy. She corrected their posture, tapping Robert's shoulders back with her fan when he slouched, showing him how to walk with measured steps rather than the country boy's lope he had arrived with. She spoke to them in French, insisting they respond in kind, and Robert struggled at first with the unfamiliar sounds. Edmund, who had been at the manor for 3 years already, helped him practice in the evenings, correcting his pronunciation with patient repetition. Sir Walter's chaplain, Father Anselm, taught the boys their letters and numbers. They gathered each afternoon in a small chamber that served as both library and scriptorium, where Father Anselm kept his precious books chained to a reading desk. Robert had never seen so many books in one place. There were perhaps a dozen volumes, more wealth in pages than his entire village possessed. Father Anselm was a learned man who had studied at Oxford, and he took his teaching duties seriously. He drilled them in Latin grammar, made them copy passages from Scripture and from Vegetius on military matters, taught them to calculate figures for household accounts. Robert discovered that he had a gift for letters, that the shapes and sounds made sense to him in a way they did not for some of the other boys. Father Anselm noticed this and began giving Robert additional passages to study, praising his careful hand and his retention of vocabulary. When Robert turned 9, Sir Walter began including him in the outdoor training that the older pages received. Each morning, after prayers and before breakfast, the boys gathered in the yard behind the manor house for physical exercise. Sir Walter himself oversaw this training, believing that a knight's squires should be toughened and skilled from their earliest years. The exercises were simple but demanding. They ran circuits around the manor grounds regardless of weather, through mud and snow and summer heat. They climbed the manor walls, finding purchase on rough stones and wooden beams. They practiced tumbling and rolling, learning to fall without injury. They wrestled in pairs, grappling until one boy yielded, or Sir Walter called a halt. Robert found the physical training both harder and more enjoyable than his household duties. His body was strong from farm work, but this training demanded different skills. He had to learn quickness and precision rather than simple endurance. Edmund, despite being 3 years older and considerably stronger, could not always best Robert in wrestling, because Robert learned to use speed and leverage to compensate for his smaller size. Martin was faster but less strong, and Robert and Martin became regular sparring partners, each pushing the other to improve. Even young Peter was included in the exercises at a level appropriate to his age, and Robert felt protective of the smaller boy, often helping him practice holds or encouraging him when he struggled. At 10, Robert was given his first wooden sword. Sir Walter presented it to him one morning after training, a simple thing of oak, weighted with lead in the pommel, to match the heft of real steel. Robert gripped it reverently, feeling the smooth wood worn by previous users, imagining the day when he might hold a true blade. Sir Walter showed them the basic guards, the fundamental positions from which all sword work flowed. High guard with the sword raised above the head, middle guard with the sword held before the chest, low guard with the point near the ground. Each guard had its purpose, its strengths and vulnerabilities. The boys practiced moving between guards smoothly, making the transitions until muscle memory took over. Then came the strikes. Sir Walter demonstrated the basic cuts, the blows that formed the foundation of medieval swordplay. The descending cut from high guard, cleaving downward with power. The horizontal cut from either side, meant to strike an opponent's flank or neck. The rising cut from low guard, aimed at legs or groin or coming up under a shield. The thrust, driving the point forward with the full weight of the body behind it. Robert practiced these strikes against a wooden pell, a thick post sunk deep in the ground. He struck it hundreds of times each day, from every angle and guard, until his hands were blistered and bleeding. Sir Walter would walk among the practicing boys, correcting stance and grip, demonstrating proper form, occasionally taking a practice sword himself to show them exactly how a movement should look. The training with wooden swords continued for years, growing gradually more complex. Robert learned combinations of strikes, flowing from one guard to another in sequences designed to overwhelm an opponent. He learned defensive techniques, parries and blocks that redirected incoming attacks. He learned footwork, the subtle positioning that could mean the difference between a clean hit and a miss. Sir Walter introduced them to the buckler, a small round shield gripped in the left hand, teaching them how to use it defensively while striking with the sword. The boys practiced against each other now, careful, controlled bouts where they learnt to judge distance and timing against a moving opponent who could strike back. Horsemanship became a central part of Robert's training when he reached his 12th year. Sir Walter kept a modest stable, perhaps 20 horses in total, ranging from heavy destriers trained for war to lighter palfreys suitable for travel. The master of horse was an old soldier named Godric, who had lost 2 fingers on his left hand to a Scottish axe many years before. Godric was gruff and impatient with foolishness, but he knew horses better than anyone Robert had ever met. He could tell at a glance if a horse was lame or ill, could gentle the most fractious stallion with a few murmured words and steady hands. Godric started Robert on a steady gelding named Thunder, patient and forgiving of mistakes. Robert learned the basics of horsemanship, how to mount and dismount properly, how to sit balanced in the saddle, how to control the horse with legs and reins and shifts of weight. He learned to care for his mount, how to brush and curry the coat, how to clean hooves and check for stones or injury, how to saddle and bridle correctly. Godric taught him that a knight's horse was his most important weapon, that a man might survive losing his sword, but would not last long without a good mount. The bond between horse and rider had to be built on trust and understanding, and Robert spent hours simply being near the horses, learning their temperaments and preferences. As his riding improved, Godric introduced more demanding skills. Robert learned to vault into the saddle without using stirrups, a technique that might save precious seconds in battle. He learned to control his horse with his legs alone, keeping his hands free for weapons. He practiced riding at speed, galloping across the manor fields while maintaining balance and control. Godric set up obstacles, low fences and ditches, teaching Robert to guide his mount over them smoothly. They practiced emergency dismounts, teaching the boys how to leap clear if their horse fell or was killed beneath them. Robert took his share of falls during this training, hitting the ground hard and getting back up with new bruises, but gradually he became confident in the saddle. At 14, Robert's status changed. Sir Walter called him into the hall one evening after supper and told him that he had proven himself worthy of advancement. Robert would become a squire, serving Sir Walter directly and receiving more intensive training in the arts of war and knighthood. The elevation was marked by a small ceremony where Robert knelt before Sir Walter and swore an oath of loyal service. Sir Walter presented him with a dagger, a real weapon with a sharp steel blade and a grip wrapped in leather, the first true weapon Robert had ever owned. Robert felt the weight of the responsibility settling on his shoulders, along with pride at how far he had come. As Sir Walter's squire, Robert's duties and privileges both increased. He moved from the cramped page's chamber to a small alcove off Sir Walter's own room, sleeping on a narrow bed rather than a straw pallet. Each morning he helped Sir Walter dress, and this included the complex process of arming when they travelled or trained for war. Robert learned the proper order for donning armour, how to lace the padded gambeson tightly enough to protect, but not so tight as to restrict movement, how to lift the heavy mail hauberk and settle it properly on Sir Walter's shoulders, how to buckle the various pieces of plate armour that Sir Walter had accumulated over his years of service. The care of Sir Walter's equipment became Robert's primary responsibility. The mail required constant attention to prevent rust, and Robert would spend hours working the hauberk in a barrel of sand and vinegar, then carefully oiling each link. The plate armour needed polishing until it gleamed, and Robert learned to check every strap and buckle for signs of wear. Sir Walter's weapons, a collection that included several swords, a mace, a war axe and various daggers, all needed to be maintained in perfect condition. Robert learned to sharpen blades properly, to oil and wrap them for storage, to check hilts and fittings for any looseness that might prove fatal in combat. His training intensified significantly. Sir Walter now trained Robert with real weapons, sharp steel that could maim or kill if used carelessly. They practiced in the yard each morning, Sir Walter testing Robert's skills with blade and buckler, exploiting every weakness, forcing Robert to adapt and improve. The night was not gentle in these sessions. Robert collected bruises and cuts, learning the hard way when his guard was too high or too low, when he committed too much to an attack and left himself vulnerable. But he also learned at a remarkable pace, his body responding to the training with increasing speed and precision. They trained with lance and shield from horseback, practicing the skills needed for mounted combat. Sir Walter had a small tilt yard constructed, and Robert learned to couch his lance properly, to lower it at exactly the right moment, to aim for the centre of a target while controlling a galloping horse. The first few runs were disasters. Robert's lance wavered, his aim was off, and he nearly unseated himself on one attempt when his lance struck the quintain off-centre, and the weighted arm swung around to strike him in the back. But Sir Walter was patient in his own rough way, demonstrating techniques and allowing Robert to practice until the movements became fluid. When Robert turned 16, Sir Walter took him on his first campaign. There was a border dispute with a neighbouring lord, and Sir Walter was obligated to muster with his overlord's forces. It was not a major war, just a brief expedition to assert territorial claims, but for Robert it was his introduction to real military life. They marched for 3 days through rain, Robert learning what it meant to be cold and wet and tired for days on end. They camped in muddy fields, Robert helping to set up Sir Walter's tent and care for the horses under miserable conditions. He saw how supplies were managed, how camps were organised for defence, how scouts were sent out to watch for enemy movements. The actual fighting, when it came, was brief and chaotic. The enemy force was smaller than expected and withdrew after a sharp skirmish. Robert barely participated, staying close to Sir Walter as ordered, his heart pounding with fear and excitement. He saw men cut down by arrows and blades, heard the screaming of wounded horses, smelled blood and voided bowels. One man, struck in the throat by an arrow, fell near Robert and died gurgling and thrashing in the mud. Robert stood frozen, unable to look away, until Sir Walter pulled him back and told him sharply to keep his wits about him. That night Robert could not sleep, kept seeing that dying man's face, hearing the horrible sounds he had made. Sir Walter found him sitting outside his tent in the darkness and sat down beside him without speaking for a while. Then the knight began talking, not about courage or glory, but about fear and death. He told Robert that every man was afraid in battle, that the fear never truly went away no matter how many fights you survived. He told Robert about the first man he had killed, how it had haunted him for months afterward. He said that a good knight acknowledged the cost of violence, understood that every blow struck was a terrible thing even when necessary. These words helped Robert more than any platitudes about bravery would have. He understood that Sir Walter was treating him as someone capable of handling truth rather than comforting lies. Over the next 2 years, Robert accompanied Sir Walter on several more campaigns, each one teaching him more about the reality of medieval warfare. He learned logistics and supply, how an army moved and fed itself, how equipment was maintained in the field. He learned tactics from watching Sir Walter and the other knights plan their movements, considering terrain and enemy dispositions. He participated in several skirmishes, finally wielding his sword in anger, finding that his training served him well even in the confusion of combat. He learned to keep his head when chaos erupted around him, to follow orders and watch for threats, to protect his knight's back and flanks. Throughout these experiences, Robert continued his broader education. Sir Walter believed that a knight needed more than martial skills, and during the long winter months when campaigning was impossible, Robert studied with Father Anselm. He read chronicles of historical battles and works on strategy by Roman and Byzantine authors. He studied law and governance, learning how manor courts worked and what responsibilities a knight had to his lord and to the people on his lands. He improved his French and began learning some Latin beyond the ecclesiastical phrases he had memorized as a page. Sir Walter also taught him heraldry, how to recognize the arms of various noble families and understand the relationships between different houses. Sir Walter ensured that Robert learned courtesy and social graces as well. Robert attended feasts and social gatherings, learning how knights conducted themselves in polite company. He learned the elaborate protocols of formal dining, the proper forms of address for different ranks, how to make conversation that was respectful without being obsequious. He learned to dance the basic steps required at court, though he never became particularly graceful at it. He learned to play chess, and Sir Walter would challenge him to matches in the evenings, using the games to teach strategy and planning. These social skills were as important as his combat training, for a knight needed to function in courtly society as well as on the battlefield. At 18, Robert had spent 10 years in Sir Walter's service. He was no longer the rain-soaked boy who had arrived at Ashford Manor clutching a small bundle. He stood over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered and strong, his body marked by the scars of training and combat. He could fight with sword and lance, on foot or mounted, and he had proven his courage and skill in several real engagements. He could read and write in 3 languages, manage accounts, understand legal documents. He had become everything that Sir Walter had hoped to make of him, and the knight decided it was time to grant Robert the honour he had earned. The dubbing ceremony took place on the feast of St. Michael. Robert spent the night before in vigil at the manor's small chapel, kneeling before the altar in prayer as was traditional. He wore a white tunic and red hose, the symbolic colours of purity and sacrifice. He reflected on the oath he would swear, the responsibilities he would assume. He thought of his mother, whom he had not seen in years, wondering if she would be proud of what he had become. He thought of his father, dead these 10 years, hoping he would have approved of the path Robert had chosen. At dawn, Sir Walter and several other knights who had gathered for the occasion entered the chapel. Robert bathed and dressed in fresh clothes, then knelt before Sir Walter in front of the altar. Sir Walter spoke the traditional words, reminding Robert of his duties to protect the church, to defend the weak, to uphold justice and serve his lord faithfully. Then Sir Walter drew his sword and touched it to Robert's shoulders, first right, then left, and finally the top of his head. "Rise, Sir Robert," the knight commanded. Robert stood, his legs shaking slightly, and Sir Walter buckled a sword belt around his waist, a new sword in a worn scabbard. The blade had been Sir Walter's own first sword, given to him at his own dubbing years before, and the knight's eyes were bright with emotion as he fastened it in place. The small company in the chapel cheered, and Robert felt tears on his cheeks that he made no effort to hide. Edmund, who had become a knight 2 years earlier and travelled back for the ceremony, embraced him warmly. Martin, now Sir Walter's senior squire, grinned and clapped him on the shoulder. Even Father Anselm smiled, a rare expression on the usually stern priest's face. They proceeded to the hall where Lady Margaret had arranged a feast to celebrate, modest by the standards of great lords but generous for a manor like Ashford. Robert sat at the high table for the first time, no longer a servant but a knight among knights. Sir Robert's story continued from there, of course. He would serve Sir Walter for several more years before receiving lands of his own, a small manor granted for faithful service. He would marry and have children, would fight in wars and settle disputes, would train his own squires and pass on the lessons he had learned. But the decade he spent at Ashford Manor had shaped everything that followed. The boy who arrived frightened and alone in the rain had become a knight, not through any single moment, but through years of patient, demanding, often painful growth. The lessons learned while carrying water and sweeping floors, while practicing with wooden swords and learning to fall from horses, while studying letters by candlelight and keeping vigil in cold chapels, all of these had built the foundation of the man he became. And in that gradual transformation lay the true story of how a medieval knight was made.